Buenos días, sean bienvenidos a la segunda conferencia del ciclo Memoria y Lenguaje. Les recordamos que estamos transmitiendo en vivo, por lo cual pueden escribir sus preguntas y hay una persona encargada de transferirnos las preguntas. Esta conferencia, como las otras, tiene una duración aproximada de 40 minutos y posteriormente tendremos aproximadamente 10 minutos para preguntas. Es un honor para mí presentar a nuestro invitado de hoy. Nos hará el favor la maestra Alma Rodríguez Lázaro de presentarlo. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, doctora Natalia Arias Trejo, y bienvenidos todos a esta transmisión, a esta conferencia del doctor N.U.I. Baker Cucona, que se llama How Prediction Supports Language, Insights from Associations. Bienvenido, doctor Cucona. Es un placer contar con su presencia en esta conferencia. Antes de cederle la palabra, me permitiré compartir con nuestro auditorio una breve semblanza suya. El doctor Baker Cucona actualmente es profesor de la Universidad de Greenwich, en Reino Unido, y sus líneas de investigación giran en torno a la psicolingüística. En específico, le interesa investigar sobre los mecanismos cognitivos que apoyan la comprensión del lenguaje y su aprendizaje. Un ejemplo de ello es la predicción en el lenguaje, donde le interesa conocer los procesos que permiten la comprensión y la forma en que los hablantes van decodificando un mensaje. También trabaja con diferentes metodologías que capturan la dinámica temporal de la cognición, como el rastreo de la mirada, el EEG, los potenciales evocados, entre otros. Es editor en la revista de Frontiers in Language Sciences y cuenta con múltiples publicaciones en revistas internacionales de alto impacto, donde ha colaborado con investigadores de diferentes países. A continuación, el Dr. Baker Cucona nos presentará su conferencia, la cual tomará aproximadamente 40 minutos, como dijo la doctora Arias Trejo, y posteriormente tendremos entre 10 y 15 minutos para preguntas y comentarios por parte de nuestro auditorio. Les podemos nosotros hacer la traducción de las preguntas que desean hacer en español. So, Dr. Baker, you can start whenever you're ready. Thank you.
Excellent. And yes, thank you so much for the invitation to present today. I'm delighted to be here. And I should apologize, I'm doing this in English and not in Spanish. My apologies. So I thought I'd talk today about prediction in language, and in particular, some work I've been really interested in about associations. So as a quick outline, to help you predict what I'm going to talk about in this presentation about prediction, I thought I'd start by saying a little bit about at least one problem that we face as language comprehenders and a solution that I think prediction might provide to this problem. I want to say a little bit about the kind of processes, maybe the mechanisms that might underpin our ability to predict, so predicting by what mechanisms. And then I want to focus on a few studies that I've done in recent years that are looking at the way that we are pre-activating meanings in language, as well as potentially pre-activating individual words. And I thought I would end by raising, I think, a final question that actually I don't know the answer to. So whatever next is kind of the section, I wanted to just say a little bit about where I'm keen to kind of go next. And I have Professor Wizard here providing us with predictions, I suppose. So I won't play this. Hopefully I don't have to twist your arm perhaps to convince you that language is fast or it can be fast. I think we're going to include the link to this little video. This is some people, I suppose maybe if you're from my generation, you might remember this person called Motormouth John, who at one point was the Guinness Book of World Records fastest talkers. He talks incredibly quickly. I think his record was something like 500 or 600 words per minute, something like that. Impressively, actually, I believe his record has been surpassed. So now there's even faster speakers. But I think the impressive thing about this clip, which if you were to watch it, is that clearly, Motormouth John is speaking really, really quickly, but I think he's still understandable. So we can still carry out language comprehension, even though language can be really, really fast. So language comprehenders must be capable of processing new words every, say, few hundred milliseconds. And this raises, I think, a really interesting question about language, which is, how do we cope with this? So you'll note that even if we had the most beautiful system of language that might ever have been created, maybe we do have that, it still has to be effective at speed, right? So we still want to be able to communicate at speed and also understand or comprehend language at speed. So an argument that has been made, and I've included a quote here from Cooperberg and Jaeger, is that given this problem, in addition to some other problems, so given the noisiness, the ambiguity, and the speed of our linguistic input, prediction is the most efficient solution for fast, efficient, and accurate comprehension. So in other words, rather than kind of waiting around to have speakers say something and then try and understand it, right? The idea of prediction is going to be that maybe what we're doing is trying to figure out what people are going to say before they actually do so. And of course, this will then be easier once they say those things to then understand it, right? We're just confirming or not confirming that they've said what we thought they were going to, and presumably that might be an easier thing to do, at least from this perspective, that prediction might be a solution to the problem of dealing with really, really rapid, fast speech. So I'm going to focus on just one paradigm today in the interest of time. There are a number of paradigms, particularly EEG, ERP, that have also been applied to studying prediction, but I'm just going to focus on eye tracking. So this is visual world eye tracking, by no means a new paradigm. So people like Cooper were doing this back in the 70s. Essentially, I suppose, as soon as eye trackers kind of were something that we could use, they were being used in this way. Although Tannenhouse et al. Have made the paradigm, I suppose, a rather more famous one. And the idea is that we're going to try and understand the black box of what it is that's happening inside of people's heads. So what is the nature of cognitive processing by tracking what it is that they're looking at. So the visual world paradigm often looks just like this, where we have people who are engaging with some visual inputs. So say a visual scene like this one with a boy and a cake and a train and a ball and a race car. And then they're also hearing language. So they might be hearing the boy will move the cake. And the idea is that we can use what they're looking at to try and understand what we think that their cognitive processing is doing. So for example, right, if they're starting to look at the cake, this is a nice indication that at that point in time, wherever it might be in the sentence, that they have then activated representations related to a cake. Now you'll note that the interesting thing about prediction is going to be, is it the case that people can actually start looking at things like a cake before they've actually heard the word cake? And indeed, in some classic work by Altman and Comite, they did find that if you give people the right sentence, the right sentences, they can do this. So for example, if you have people hearing the boy will eat the cake, the idea is that people can in fact use the selection or restrictions of verb like eat to predict what they're going to hear about. And I'm going to present a number of these graphs. So I'll walk through this. So it's just time along the horizontal axis. It's the proportion or the probability of looking along the vertical axis. And you can kind of just focus on the black symbols for our purposes. And the idea is that as people are hearing eat, which is the curve that has black circles, this is beginning to diverge from the curve with the black squares, which is hearing move, which is less predictive of a cake. And critically, it's from about 700 milliseconds here that people are actually beginning to hear the word cake. But you'll note that the two curves are diverging before this point. So they're diverging from, say, even, I don't know, 200 into 400, and certainly before 700 milliseconds. So that black circle curve from the black square curve. So nice evidence for what I'm going to call pre-activation, right, which is just the simple idea that even before people hear a word like cake, they might potentially be able to, in certain sentence contexts like this one, be able to predict what they're going to hear next. So I wanted to talk today a little bit about what are the kind of mechanisms that might enable people to do this. One, which I think links rather straightforwardly into the literature, is that what people are doing is something like what they do when they're performing a closed probability task. So some of you might have done one of these before. So this is just a task in which you basically give people a sentence fragment, so an incomplete sentence, and then they just have to say, well, how would you complete the rest of this? And the interesting thing about a task like this is that it is, in a very explicit way, combining comprehension and production, right? So you have to comprehend a little bit of the fragment, and then you're basically getting people to produce back, often they're writing down what they think the completion is for the sentence. So this has been termed in the literature, and I'm going to use this term, prediction by production. And I think the name makes straightforward sense if you think about the closed probability task involving comprehension and production. And the idea is going to be that the same kind of cognitive processes that people might recruit to do this task, to hear part of a sentence and then complete the rest of it, might actually be exactly what they're doing when they're hearing a sentence like "the boy will eat" and then looking at the cake. So they're essentially using their production system to try and generate the completion that makes sense in that context. Oh yes, and this is actually from, if you use Google, essentially it's trying to do this for you. So if you type in something like, "when life gives you lemons, make," and the saying goes, right, it should be lemonade. So it's something like people are doing something like this, even in the case of language comprehension. I'll note that Google also has margaritas as a completion here, which seems like also a nice option. Although I don't, so far as I'm aware, that's not as frequent of a phrase as is "when life gives you lemons, make lemonades." And indeed, if you were, I think, to give a sentence like this to participants, most would complete it with lemonade. Another mechanism, and the one that I'm going to focus on today, is closely related to priming. So semantic priming, we've known for a long, long time that if you hear a prime like doctor, and then you have to do something like a lexical decision for a target like nurse, you're faster given the relationship between doctor and nurse in terms of their meaning, their semantics, their associations. So priming has a long kind of history of being linked to the idea of spreading excitation or spreading activation among representations in, say, the mental lexicon. So Collins and Loftus have described a theory like this, among a number of other people. So Dell, McClellan and Ellman, and so on. So another perspective on this is that what people might be doing in the case of prediction in language comprehension is prediction by association. So the cognitive processes that are supporting priming, so priming among associated representations, this might also be at play in the case of prediction. Now, a number of recent proposals have actually made the claim that prediction might actually depend on multiple mechanisms. So it doesn't have to be an either or, production or association. It might actually be the case that our systems are making use of both of these things. A number of others have also been proposed by Huding, for example. So there might be, these two might also be supplemented by additional mechanisms. But one of the questions I've been really interested in is, well, whether or not there's either or maybe even a combination of these, is can you differentiate them? Can you differentiate the way that they're contributing, that they're supporting prediction during language comprehension? And I've been really interested in the idea that a kind of natural prediction about prediction by association is that it's going to be what I'm going to call, it should be what I'm going to call dumb. So with prediction by association, what we would expect is that, yes, this will sometimes get us predictable information. However, alongside this, it's also going to buy us rather less predictable information that's nevertheless associated with the kind of contextual information that we might be receiving. So for example, if you were to think about doctor and nurse, right, in maybe a sentence context in which after you hear doctor, it makes sense to hear nurse, the idea is that prediction by association is going to be activating a whole bunch of things related to doctor, not just nurse, but maybe those other things that are kind of identified on the previous slide, right? So maybe a word like physician and dentist and so on, even though they might not make sense in the sentence context. So it's kind of dumb in this sense that it's, yes, getting you predictable stuff, but also all this other stuff that's not predictable, but kind of associated. Okay, so the aim for the 3 studies that I thought I'd speak about today are going to be to investigate whether comprehenders are pre-activating associated but unpredictable information, as is hypothesized by prediction by association. In other words, is it the case that prediction is in some ways dumb? Although I'm going to come back to this and potentially reframe it. So the first study, we looked at the pre-activation of meanings, and I'm also calling this arresting the policeman, which should sound rather like an unpredictable scenario. The second is looking at a different aspect of pre-activating meanings. So I've called this eating the car. And then the final that I wanted to mention is shifting over from looking at the pre-activation of meaning over to the idea of whether or not we can actually pre-activate individual words. And then I've called this, so the rain and the cloud. So what do those things possibly have to do with each other? Okay, so the first study looked like this. In some ways, it's related to the Altman and Comide study that I spoke about just a few slides previously. So participants are hearing sentences like Toby was arrested by the, and in this case, the kind of predictable completion would be policeman. And indeed, we have a policeman in the visual array here. So the idea is that we're going to have people, again, listening to these sentences. We can monitor their eye movements, see, is it the case that they can look to the policeman even before they've heard the word policeman? But there's a critical difference relative to the Altman and Comide study. So in that study, of course, it was you hear a verb like eat, and then there's just the cake, which was edible. In this case, there is a parallel, so it's arrest, and we have a policeman, which goes very nicely with that verb. But critically, we also have a crook in here. So you'll note that both policeman and crook are closely associated with a verb like arrested, although in this case, it's only the policeman that makes sense as a completion, right? So it would be more typical that you would arrest a crook rather than that you would be arrested by a crook. So the idea of dumb pre-activation that we were looking at is, even though it's the case that this sentence is setting us up for a predictable completion of the policeman, is it nevertheless the case that we do get looking to the crook as well? So due to the fact that it is associated with the verb arrested. And this, of course, is something that we might predict given prediction by association. So our predictions, to elaborate, look like this. So we thought if all that's going on is prediction by production, if behavior should essentially look like it would in a closed task, right? So if we just gave people sentences like, Toby was arrested by blank, we'd expect that most people would say policeman. If likewise during language comprehension, this is all that's happening, we'd expect most predictive looking to the policeman, with no real difference between the crook and the surfer here, where surfer is just completely unrelated to that verb. And on the other hand, we thought, well, if prediction by association is what's playing a crucial role in prediction, that we expect the pattern like that on the right here, where yes, there's lots of looking to the policeman, which is predictable and associated. But alongside this, we also expect looking to the crook because it is associated, even if it's not predictable. And the pattern that we found was the following. So there is a divergence between the crook, which is the squares, relative to the completely unrelated surfer, which is in the triangles. And the idea is that this is even happening before people are hearing the noun. At the same time, there is also the largest amount of looking to the policeman. So despite the sentence context, more looks were observed to the crook than to the surfer before the noun policeman. So these associated but unpredictable representations do seem to be pre-activated. So we took this as evidence that, yeah, in some ways prediction is kind of dumb. So comprehenders are pre-activating unpredictable things where they happen to also be associated alongside things that are fully predictable. Although one of the thoughts we had was that there does seem to be something rather special, at least in these two experiments I've highlighted, about the verb, right? So in both of these experiments, it's really the verb that's buying people the ability to predict what the kind of final noun in these sentences is going to be. So, right, eat and cake and arrest and policeman. And indeed, in this study, actually, in order to design it properly, we went and tried to have these two nouns, so policeman and crook, which were really, really strongly related to the verbs, although given these different relationships, right? So policeman as an agent and the crook as a patient. But we thought, well, maybe this pattern is unique given that, the verbs are playing this very kind of compelling role in kind of assisting people in pre-activating things. So in a second study, we said, well, can you get this if you kind of play with other constraints within a sentence? So we presented sentences like this one. So the boy will eat the white and its cake. So even more closely paralleling Altman and Kamide. Here we have a white cake. We also have a brown cake. So it kind of makes it pragmatically useful that there's an adjective, a color adjective in here to help comprehenders distinguish what it is that is being talked about. But the kind of crucial thing is that we have these two cars in here as well. So these are not edible. They're not predictable completions of these sentences. We didn't actually do this, although I suspect if we were to give people sentences like the boy will eat the white, I don't think anyone would say car as a completion. So they're not particularly predictable. But you'll note that in the case of the white car, it does have this color association with the adjective that, for example, the brown car does not. So both white cake and car are associated with white, although only the white cake is a predictable completion. Although, again, returning to this idea of dumb prediction, if something like that is really happening, then we might expect that white goes with white car, so we'd get more looking to the white than to the brown car based on these kind of color associations. So these are the results. In short, this is essentially what we found. So even though the verb does have this very compelling influence on what people are doing, so you'll note that they're hearing the verb, which is plotted all the way to the far left here, so hearing eat. And indeed, people do start looking at the cake more than the cars. it is the case that once people then start hearing white, so a few words down, that the purple curve, which is the white car, does begin to diverge from the brown car based off of those color associations. So despite the sentence context, more looks are observed to the white than the brown car. So again, this kind of associated but unpredictable information is influencing on these predictive eye movements that people are making, even before, in this case, they hear the noun cake. So again, we're getting or observing evidence for this kind of dumb prediction. And we're getting it even where it's not just these kind of competitors that are really closely related to the verb, as in the case of something like crook. So here it's just, it matches an adjective that people happen to be hearing, and that's enough to kind of activate this associated but not predictable white car. So you'll note that in both of these experiments, there is a question about what it is that's actually being pre-activated. So one possibility is that people are thinking of these words. So they might be pre-activating policeman and crook and cake and car as actual words, although that doesn't have to be the case, right? So presumably they could alternatively just be thinking about the kind of semantics or the visual information about things that go with the sentence context that people are hearing. So we were also interested in, do you get something like dumb prediction for actual word forms, for the actual words that people might be hearing based off of a sentence context? And indeed, this is something where there has been a good amount of kind of back and forth. So is it the case that people can really pre-activate words? And indeed, there was some initial evidence from EEG, from DeLong and colleagues, that showed that perhaps people could do this, although a subsequent replication study then showed that actually there weren't very compelling effects there, at least from a pre-activation point of view. So we thought, well, could we look at this kind of a thing in the visual world paradigm using eye movements? So this is a study that builds closely on some work that Ito and colleagues did, using arrays like this one, where participants are hearing sentences like, the tourists expected rain when the sun went behind, and then it's going to be the cloud, which is kind of pictured at the top left here. And the crucial thing is that included within this visual array are objects that have a phonological relationship among them. So there's the cloud and the clown, which share an onset and a vowel. And the idea is that in very old visual world research, it's been shown that people are really sensitive to these kinds of phonological relationships. So for example, Alapena et al. Found something like, if you just hear the word cloud, people will do a lot of looking to the clown, given that phonological overlap, because spoken word processing is incremental. So as soon as you're hearing the onset of the ka, right, you're kind of looking at all the things that go along with that information. So the way that this was meant to work is that we wanted to see, well, if people are actually pre-activating word forms, so phonological information like the phonological structure of cloud, then do we also get something like the overlapping or the kind of spread of activation to other phonologically related objects like a clown, even before you've heard the phonology of the word cloud, but rather based off of the sentence context. So it's context like this, so that tourists expected rain when the sun went behind the. So that was the first study, and indeed this is closely based on some work that Ito had done. But we also wanted to compare a kind of lexical version of this. Again, we're kind of interested in the way that these predictive effects might be emerging from the spread of activation of excitation within the mental lexicon. So this idea of prediction by association. So we said, well, actually, if we do an analog, but a single word case, do we get something similar? So you'll note that one of the critical words in the sentence context, which I'm labeling 3A here, for the tourist expected rain when the sun went behind the, is just the word rain, right? So rain is very closely associated with cloud. So in a second study, which I'm calling 3B, we essentially didn't give participants a sentence context. We only gave them this word, and we said, is this going to produce a similar or a different pattern than we might observe with the sentence context? So these were the results for the sentence context. And then this nicely replicated the pattern that was observed by Ito et al. Essentially, it's people hearing the tourist expected rain when the sun went behind the, that's in the kind of first part of the graph here, from 0 to about just over 3,500 milliseconds. And the crucial thing is that while people are doing the most amount of looking to the cloud, they are also looking more to the clown, which is phonologically related to the cloud, than they are to an unrelated word like the globe. So this does seem like people are activating not just the semantics of the cloud, but also its phonological form. And this is trickling forward. It's kind of also spreading out to related phonological forms like clown. So we do in fact get, at least in a case like this, pre-activation of phonological information, and Ito et al. Found something very similar. The case that we were really interested in, though, was this one. So on the left here, this is just kind of the standard Alapena et al. Effect. So if you just give people the word cloud, they do the most looking at the cloud, but initially they also look a lot at the clown. The critical case is on the right here, which is what happens if you don't give people a predictive sentence context that goes on about tourists and rain and so on, but you just give people the word rain. And what we found is that you get something analogous to the sentence context case, which is that if you hear rain, you do the most amount of looking to the cloud, but you also do quite a lot of looking, or participants do quite a lot of looking to the clown, even though clown has really nothing in and of itself to do with rain. There is this kind of mediated relationship where rain has to do with cloud, and then cloud sounds like phonologically clown. So even in the lexical case, phonological information is getting activated. So that cloud-clown relationship. So evidence that comprehenders are pre-activating phonological information, so cloud-clown, when they're hearing predictive sentences, but that they're also doing this exact kind of similar thing, even if they're just hearing the word rain. So this also complements, which I've identified, some related findings, which will probably be familiar to many here, which is that even if you look at children, they do a kind of similar mediated kind of priming effect. So if they hear pero, you'll get looks to galleta, given the mediated relationship that pero and gato are semantically related, and then there's a phonological relationship between gato and galleta. So something similar happening in this context as well. So we've taken this as evidence that prediction, again, may be supported in this very compelling way by prediction by association, by this spread of activation. And these kind of findings really point out that it's not just excitation spreading across semantics, but you can even get it across sort of different levels, varying levels within the meta-lexicon, where it can go across semantics, and then even as well across phonological relationships or phonological associations. Okay, so those are the kind of studies that I wanted to focus on in this kind of way of thinking about the way that prediction might be dumb. Although I want to revisit this idea. So across the literature over a number of decades, there has been some kind of back and forth about prediction. And often it's about the idea of prediction by production, right? So this idea that we are able to form these really precise, really accurate kind of predictions about the specific words that we're going to be hearing. So something like the behaviors that we're seeing in a closed probability task, that people are basically doing that all the time when you're just comprehending language. And there are some kind of, I think, important limitations in thinking about something like prediction by production. One is that if you really think about it, in some ways, it doesn't necessarily solve the problem of, say, having to deal with really fast language, I think, right? Because the idea is that if you're involving comprehension plus prediction, right, this is likely to require resources and time to put together all the information and to shift from comprehension to production and all these kinds of things. And it does make you wonder, well, wouldn't it just be easier to just wait and hear what people are actually going to say than to ramp up this additional process of having to not just comprehend the current word you're hearing, but to also try and be predicting the next word that you're going to be hearing? There's something funny about all that must be involved in being able to do that. Does that really reflect the solution to having to deal with speech, which is really, really fast, and having to try and arrive at an interpretation in a kind of efficient and fast way? A number of related observations, I think, have been made. So Go's made one, which is that actually, if you look at a lot of language, it's going to be the case that actually most words aren't predictable, and a lot of predictions are not going to turn out to be correct, right? So does it even make sense to be putting all this effort into kind of mechanisms, into processes which aren't even going to get you right where you might want to be in the end? So even if you think about a sentence like "the boy will eat," right? Presumably at "the" and "boy," and even as you're hearing "eat," right, you probably wouldn't be able to predict any of those things. So does it make sense to have this mechanism that's doing all this work when for much of that sentence, right, you can't even predict what you're going to hear about anyway? So I've started to think that maybe characterizing prediction by association as dumb is not the right way to think about it at all, but rather that kind of rapidly pre-activating associated but unpredictable information representations alongside predictable stuff is actually kind of smart, in the sense of, if you can do this without having to engage a lot of resources and a lot of time, it seems like a pretty good way at kind of maybe getting close to where what you're going to be hearing about is related to. And very often, it might allow you to stumble into what is something like good enough accuracy anyway. And indeed, one of the kind of closely related literatures I really like is if you really look at things like masked semantic priming. And a lot of the effects in there are sort of almost dumbfoundingly fast, right? So it's not even hundreds of milliseconds, but even within tens of milliseconds, that people can kind of be facilitated by associations among representations. So it does seem like associations, something like priming, is something that can happen really fast. It doesn't seem to require a tremendous amount of resources, tremendous amount of time. So this might actually be a really smart solution for being able to do prediction when you're hearing really fast speech. So to begin to wrap up, how do comprehenders cope with the rapidity of language? I kind of started with this question. So there's lots of evidence now here, as well as by lots and lots of people, that people do seem to be able to very compellingly pre-activate meanings and also words. Although I think the research, the kind of findings that I've cited here, do emphasize this idea that a lot of prediction is pretty dumb, I've put this in quotes, in that people are activating predictable things, but they are also activating a lot of unpredictable things that have a relationship, have an association, with the sentence context that comprehenders might be hearing. I think it kind of also emphasizes that prediction by association might play this really important role in prediction, potentially alongside prediction by production. And again, I think actually there might be something misleading about calling this dumb prediction, that in some ways it might be really smart to have just activate a whole bunch of associated things if you can do it really rapidly without many resources, if it can kind of get you in the rough ballpark of what you might be hearing about next. So I wanted to end just by saying a little bit about what I'm kind of excited about looking at next. I think there is a kind of disconnect between something I started with, kind of claim I made at the beginning, and the way that a lot of research, including my own, has been conducted. So if you look at psycholinguistic literature, I think it's really clear that people can deal with really rapid speech. So just to give some numbers here, so Cooperman estimated that we can, without any kind of hindrance on our accuracy, we can understand speech at over 6.5 syllables per second. But interestingly, if you go and look at a lot of visual world research, and I've done a similar thing with a lot of EEG research, what you'll find is that actually in a lot of these studies, language is being presented actually really slowly. So Fernandez looked at a number of studies. Actually, the vast majority of visual world studies don't report speech speed information at all. But among those that did, they found that it's something like 1, 2, maybe 3 syllables per second that is the speed that a lot of the language that's being presented in studies like the ones that I've talked about is again being presented. So very much not at the kind of upper end of our capacity, let's say 6, 7 syllables per second. So I do think there is this kind of worrying disconnect between our theories, right, which might say we do all this stuff to deal with the rapidity of speech, versus the way that we might actually be studying these things where actually we're not looking at particularly rapid speech at all. And I think a final thing to kind of connect back to the studies I've also shown is that one thing you might say, right, is that even though people are looking at the unpredictable associated thing, across all 3 of them, they were looking at the predictable thing the most. So one of the things I'm very interested in is, well, how does that relationship change potentially as you start to look at prediction of kind of speech that's perhaps as it would more typically be in natural conversation. And I thought I'd end with just a first kind of study that we've run. There is no focus on what I've been calling dumb prediction here. This is just kind of, we wanted to say, look, how fast can people hear sentences and still have the capacity to predict? Can they even get to 6 syllables per second? Can they go even faster? So I won't say very much about this. And in fact, this is from COVID. So this is actual mouse data. But I'll let you can kind of interpret it just like the eye movement plots. The idea is that it's time on the horizontal axis. And then the vertical axis is something like how close that they have moved their mouse to the predictable thing. And then this is just contrasting a predictable context to a non-predictable context. So in red, it's people hearing something about a man riding a bike, and then in blue, it's spotting a bike. So a predictable versus non-predictable. And then the crucial thing is that the plot at the far left is at a typical visual world speed, it's around 3, say, syllables per second. In the middle, it's 6 syllables per second. So pushing on the kind of Cooperman estimate. And then the final on the far right is at 9 syllables per second. And the crucial thing is that we do observe prediction in all 3. So people do move closer to the bike before they hear the word bike, even at up to 9 syllables per second, which is pretty fast, actually. So we weren't necessarily sure that we would get that. And yeah, so I'm really interested in if you take apart a lot of the literature on prediction, what do those effects now look like when you start to move into speech, which isn't at 1, 2, 3 syllables per second, but now is pushing on this idea that we can understand really rapid speech. So what does prediction look like in that context? Yeah, and I will end there. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Anui Kukona. That was really interesting, and I think we have had several questions from the audience that probably you can answer right now. Well, some of them would be, well, the first one would be, what is the difference between priming and prediction by association?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And so I think I feel like one difficulty in answering this question actually is that there is, of course, a much older, richer history with priming that preceded all of this stuff with prediction, which kind of sets up that, yeah, you have to distinguish that how is prediction different than the kind of priming literature that has been studied for so long. And I think the answer that I've become comfortable with is that all of the priming literature may be making use of the kind of mechanisms that are also supporting prediction, right? So I don't think that, right, we're biologically designed to have a mechanism that allows us to do a priming study. But I do think we have these kind of these biological mechanisms that allow us to do language comprehension. So yeah, so I think one way of thinking about it is that what priming might be picking up on is the exact kind of mechanisms that we may be using when we're trying to understand language, when we're trying to, you know, predict what's coming up next. And there is this way that then a priming study is kind of piggybacking on that mechanism, and maybe that's what the relationship is like there. But yeah, I think a really good question. In some ways, yeah, I would say priming is picking up on prediction by association. Yeah.
Right, the boundaries there.
Yeah.
Both processes. Okay, thank you. And we have also an interesting one, which is from Penelope Montoya. Studies 3A and 3B must work differently in second language users. Are there any studies with bilinguals or ESL learners? Or what would be the predictions about those?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, yeah, so I should have the caveat that, yeah, all of this study is with typical monolingual adult speakers who actually we screen out, you know, people with any kind of cognitive differences. So that is a really good question about how these things might work differently in other populations. Yeah, so I kind of, I do kind of mention here that, right, that, so this idea of the priming kinds of stuff where you just have the single words, I do kind of mention the study here that Natalia here, or Professor Natalia did, looking at kids, I think that they're as young as like 30 months. They'll do something similar where if they hear the pedo, you'll get the priming, not just for gato, but for words that do sound like gato, which does kind of suggest that, you know, maybe that part of this is something that bilinguals might also show, you know, that, I don't know, that it can develop fairly quickly. On the other hand, I think in that study, they also did find that, and I probably could get corrected here, that if you look at younger kids, that actually that effect doesn't show up. So maybe I think in 2-year-olds, something like that. So yeah, so it might be this thing that yeah, it takes experience to develop something like mediated priming. So, you know, something like the less experienced bilinguals might not show the effects as strongly as later bilinguals. I have not done that study, and unfortunately, I can't think off the top of my head of a study that has done that. That could be the case. But yeah, no, I think that's really an interesting thing. And in some ways, which I think is the argument, you know, that often gets made from a developmental point of view, is that all of these kind of mediating effects, right, aren't things that are necessarily there to begin with. there is this way that, there has to be development among the associations in there, or about the way that they talk to each other online. And so, yeah, it could be something that also has to develop for bilinguals with a new language. Yeah, a good question. Yeah.
Yeah,
I would love to see that study if anyone wants to do it.
Thank you. Okay, so we also have another one from Marco Flores Coronado, and he's asking, could you further explain the difference between active or passive roles to be predicted in experiment 1? And the second question would be, could such difference be an example of enacting meaning through syntactic relevance?
Yeah, say the second part just again.
Yeah, could such difference be an example of enacting meaning through syntactic relevance?
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, so just to say a little bit more here. So the idea is that in this study, every single sentence was about Toby. So for these people, they just keep hearing things like Toby was arrested, and I can't even think of other things. Toby went to a lot of adventures, let's just say that. So the idea is that we wanted to make it such that that first role there was really clearly always occupied by Toby. And actually that's meant to be Toby pictured in the middle there. So we tried to really make it that there's no ambiguity that that role at least is already occupied by Toby. So in this kind of a context, it doesn't make any sense to be thinking about crooks, because the sentence context is clearly Toby is the kind of patient there. You get to a verb of arrested, and then the thing that makes clear sense both in this sentence context but also across this whole experiment is going to be that agent as the predictable continuation. And yeah, so I think our initial prediction was, I think, right, this idea that, well, syntax is this powerful thing. It's very clear that you've already got the patient there, then you get a verb with semantics, and then it should be the case that you predict the policeman, and there shouldn't be very much consideration of the crook at all. But yeah, I mean, I like to think, right, that these kind of studies do emphasize this idea that, maybe syntax doesn't have this as powerful of an impact on everything. That, even though syntax might say, well, you should be doing this one thing, don't pay attention to agents anymore. Semantics still gets to be like, well, we have these associated things over here. And then, that has this influence then on people where they are looking. Yeah, I think in the paper, we kind of frame it as there is this kind of flexibility among things that, yeah, syntax might say something and it kind of points people down that path. And ultimately, right, they do look at the policeman the most, that is consistent with what makes sense for the syntax. But also there is still this way that associations get to kind of roar their voice a little bit at the same time. So there is this kind of juggling and flexibility among these different constraints. Yeah, and it kind of makes sense in a constraint-based kind of perspective. Yeah, good question.
Yeah, thank you. And lastly, last question would be a personal one. So what would you say that the role of memory in language prediction?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, obviously, I think, it's interesting because I think associations actually starts pushing the interesting things about prediction down into something like the mental lexicon and like conceptual knowledge, which then I think means, right, we should care a lot more in thinking about, well, how do we conceptualize the mental lexicon, conceptual knowledge, because that's then going to have a lot of influence on what people are doing in the context of language comprehension, in the context of doing things like prediction. And yeah, I think that does kind of, it inspires this new work that's very much concerned with, maybe atypical kinds of memory cases, whatever, lesions or, those kinds of studies, and trying to link them more so to prediction. And then also maybe, looking back to a lot of research that's been done before that was maybe not explicitly about prediction, but that might have been about sentence, comprehension, and maybe thinking about prediction as a way of kind of understanding why those deficits might be there where they happen, happen to be. but yeah, I think, yeah, this very much does, put a lot of emphasis on memory. I think, in some ways, prediction by association is kind of a theory of prediction originating out of the structure of conceptual memory or semantic memory, in this, really interesting way.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Well, and I think that will be all from the audience, the questions that we had so far. So thanks a lot, Dr. Aniue Cucona. Let's go with Dr. Natalia Arias Trejo.
Thank you very much. Such an interesting talk. And as we can see in the question and some of the things you said, there are a lot of studies to do and a lot of other populations to study. So let's keep on this topic on the role of prediction on language comprehension. Thank you very much, Dr. Aniue Cucona. We are going to get you a certificate in a few days, and we hope to interact with you more. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, no, thank you for having me. This is, fantastic questions. It's good food for thought and inspiration with what to do next.
Yeah. Muchas gracias a la audiencia. Les recordamos que tendremos hacia finales de noviembre nuestra tercera y última conferencia como parte de este ciclo. Muchas gracias por su presencia, muchas gracias Alma y muchas gracias al equipo técnico de UDEMAT que hacen posible esta transmisión. Buenos días.
Buenos días.